𝗬𝗪, Clifftop Crisis and Transformation. Written by Tao Wang. Narrated by Eric Yang. Blood bubbled from pale lips as his jen wavered. The glittering jade-green inlay in the weapon darkened by blood and dirt. All along the edge of the weapon, long chips could be seen. Even as 𝗬𝗵 labored over, waterfall spray struck 𝗬𝗵's face and body, dampening bloodied and torn clothing. Opposite him, on the bare granite cliff top, his opponent, his sworn brother, his most beloved, stood, injured, bleeding from a cut along one hand, but in much better shape. "Why?" 𝗬𝗵 roared, anguished. "Why betray me, brother?" "You fool. I never thought of you as a true brother." 𝗵𝗂 twisted his large guandao, the polearm swishing through the air. In the distance, rocks fell, dislodged from the stray energy of their attacks, rumbling as they fell and crashed. All around them, the thunder of the waterfall drowned out the sounds of nature. "You thought I would ever consider one of you preening nobles a brother?" "I shared everything with you," 𝗬𝗵 said, his sword dipping a little. 𝗵𝗂 shifted, only for 𝗬𝗵 to tighten his grip on his weapon. His long, luxurious hair was in disarray, the ends burnt and crisped from the sneak attack that had struck him from behind. His luxurious robes, gold and red, glittered a little, the defensive talismans within broken but attempting to recover. "You gave me scraps," 𝗵𝗂 spat to the side. "You invited me when it did not inconvenience you, when it was appropriate for you to have a low-born commoner friend, or you wanted someone to guard your back. Everything of worth, you kept me away from." "I did not," 𝗬𝗵 said. "You lied to yourself again. All you nobles lie to yourself all the time," sneered 𝗵𝗂. "But I'm done with it. Done with you." "And so you attacked me in the back? What would our master say?" Even as he spoke, he churned his qi. He pulled on his metal element, drawing it from his core once more. His sword glowed, the brilliant jade edging taking in the metal qi, a phantom edge of gray and green forming along the weapon. 𝗬𝗵 drew the weapon towards him, knowing he only had one attack left. "You'll never know anything, but that you fell. Nobly." 𝗵𝗂 laughed, throwing his head back as his beard flapped and twisted in the wind driven by the waterfall. That moment of distraction was all 𝗬𝗵 was looking for. The injured cultivator threw himself forward, his attack forming a brilliant glow of gray gold as his metal qi formed around him. He streaked forward like an arrow, ready to take advantage of 𝗵𝗂's distraction. He never noticed the small carving on the ground, formed when 𝗵𝗂 spun his weapon. A charged temporary enchantment exploded, throwing rock and flame into the sky, catching 𝗬𝗵 by surprise and disrupting his attack. 𝗬𝗵's last sight as he tumbled away, caught in the explosion, was the sweeping blade of his opponent's guandao, striking him in his chest, tearing through his defenses and sending him flying off the waterfall. Blood sprayed, even as he heard his brother, his enemy, speak. "You were always too straightforward." Then, the water took him. Cold, damp, constraining. He could not breathe, could not see. Bubbles and water, blood and pain, tumbling rocks and undertow of currents. It took him down in the water, deep within the carved basin beneath, and threatened to keep him down forever. Twisting and turning, almost releasing him from the falls before he was sucked down once again by the undercurrents of the water. Again and again, he was released and then pulled back, his lungs burning with agony, blood mixing with the ice-blue water. His body locked up under the cold, and eventually, even consciousness fled. Death should have been his reward. 𝗬𝗍 of the 10 courts and 1,000 hells should have been where he next woke up, awaiting judgment. He had failed, as a cultivator, as a man, and deserved no more. But when has life ever offered us what one deserved? Far better to receive what it offered in gratitude and humbleness than demand justice and fairness from an uncaring universe. And so, 𝗧𝗍𝗪 found himself alive, despite all his failures. Alive only because he was a core cultivator and had plunged deep into the ice-cold water of the river, closing down and slowing the loss of blood from his injuries. Alive but injured, for the unyielding water and the hard-edged rocks below had taken their toll, shattering bones and cracking skull. He woke, slowly, in pain, flowing river water lapping against soggy, once expensive silk robes. Rounded river pebbles lay beneath his body, offering no more comfort than the hard jade bed he slept on in the sect, that he used to sleep on. Almost on instinct, 𝗧𝗍𝗪 reached deep into himself towards his core to pull energy from it to begin the healing process. Instead of finding the glimmering, hard, metal-encased core of compressed qi sitting in his dantian, he found shattered remains that dug into his spirit, sending shards of psychic pain through his mind and soul. He screamed as pain greater even than being cut nearly in half erupted through him. 𝗧𝗍𝗪 cried, and in the distance heard voices, footsteps. He tried to move, hurry away, fearing his ex-brother had come for him, and failed as pain increased, driving him back once more into darkness. He woke the next time warm and still in pain. He was drowsy, barely able to focus, his blood loss having continued through the intervening period. If he was not a core cultivator, if he had not progressed his body. But 𝗧𝗍𝗪 was all that, and he lived. A soft wool blanket covered his body, and a comforter lay beneath his body, offering what little padding it could between him and the rough wooden board he lay upon. His bed rocked and rumbled, the turning of wooden wheels on rocky ground offering him a hint of where he was. It was musty in here, filled with bolts of cloth and wool, of bundled cloth packed high and tight. It was dark too, as the insides of the wagon resolved before his tired eyes. He held still for a long moment before trying to rise. The pain drove him back, the cut that lay across his chest bandaged now and wrapped, but still weeping blood and a little pus. 𝗧𝗍𝗪 realized he was feverish. His body shivered and a part of him marveled at the novel sensation. He had not felt that in decades. As bad as the physical damage was, it was the spiritual one that kept him down. His core was in shards, his dantian damaged. Qi that he automatically drew within him leaked right out, his dantian unable to hold it all within. His meridians, at least, seemed mostly undamaged, but he could not cultivate. Not like this. As he drowsily contemplated his situation, 𝗧𝗍𝗪 heard a noise. Voices, softly murmuring on the outside of the moving wagon. "Will he survive?" a female said, filled with worry. "Maybe. He's a cultivator. They heal very fast," a male voice replied, much deeper and older, weary and guarded. "Good. Good." Relieved. "Not good. Cultivators are all trouble. If we could tell what sect he was from." Doubt, now. 𝗧𝗍𝗪 wondered why they could not, and then remembered the damage he had taken, the time in the water and the blood. It probably had stained his clothing, maybe even removed the outer garments. "We should not have picked him up." "Father!" Scandalized. "He needed help." "And what if he is a demon worshipper? Or just one of those noble idiots?" the father hissed. "You always said to treat others like you would wish to be treated." Hurt. I meant for mortals, not cultivators. They're different. They were mortals before, and we're all cultivators anyway. Some of us just aren't very good. In either case, her voice drifted away. Perhaps she had moved farther away or lowered it. He was not sure, but the muffled noises disappeared. 𝗀𝗧 leaned a little, hoping to hear them. Then, he realized how precariously balanced he had been, how little space there had been in the overly filled wagon. He fell. Pain ripped through him, and his tenuous handle on consciousness faded.
Uncle Lou!
A high-pitched voice, a small child running up to him. 𝗀𝗧 bent down and picked up the child, spinning him around and fending off sticky hands that clutched at his cheeks. You little brat, this is a new robe.
Aww,
the child cried, pouting, and then he smiled.
Mother says you should come in. It's time for dinner.
Very well. Tell her I'll be in once I finish this batch. He waved down at the bundles of clothing recently dropped off by the merchant team. 𝗀𝗧's job was to check, verify, categorize, and then store it all in the stockroom behind the family compound. Later on, they would move some of the bolts over to the stores itself. Stores. 𝗀𝗧 smiled at that thought, thinking of how the 𝗍 family clothing store had grown. They now had 3 stores in the city, all of them well-stocked and doing brisk business. They all served different clientele, with some overlap. The work they had done in the last half-decade had seen them develop steadily.
No! She said you should come in now, or else you'll just work out here till dinner is cold.
𝗍𝗺, the child, pouted up at him, 7 years old, and cute, and knowing it. I promise I'll be in soon. I just need to finish the count. I promise, 𝗀𝗧 said.
Promise. If you break it, you know Mother will be angry.
Of course, 𝗀𝗧 nodded gravely before he let 𝗍𝗺 down. Grinning, 𝗍𝗺 scampered away, barely listening as 𝗀𝗧 called out for him to wash his hands before eating. Then, distraction gone, he turned back to his work. Hours later, soft footsteps interrupted his work. Under the bare light of a few lanterns, oil lanterns, not the spirit stone lanterns he had once been so used to, he had continued working. How can you see in this? The voice was so familiar. Even half a decade later, it brought 𝗀𝗧 a little of the same sense of security and reassurance he had felt when he had heard it outside the wagon. Cultivator eyes, 𝗀𝗧 said. Not that they hadn't had this conversation before. 𝗖𝗹𝗶𝗂 swayed up to him, just as beautiful as the first day he had seen her when she had brought in soup for him. Though 𝗀𝗧 cursed his eyes for noting the wrinkles that had begun at the corner of her eyes, and the slight weight she had gained, padding out her too slim figure from before. Cultivator eyes, for sure. Still, he found himself smiling at her casual dismissal. Did I miss dinner again? Of course you did. She sighed and raised the tray she held in her hands, turning and setting the food aside. You must stop that. You know I don't need to eat as much. Or rest as much, because you're a cultivator. 𝗂𝗶 mimicked his voice, putting a weary tone on it. Then, she softened her tone, worried eyes looking up at his own and searching for truth as she asked, How does it go? The cultivation? A nod. Slowly. It will be many decades more before I am done. A lie. A white lie, one that would not harm her. He would already have been done if he had not chosen to slow down his cultivation. Even if his dantian, his soul, ached at the shards that still lay in his body, it ached less than the thought of what he would have to do once he was healed. You should stop working so hard and focus on that, 𝗂𝗶 said, shaking her head. I cannot let you just feed me. You've done more than enough. Your knowledge of where to find good cloth, Your help in dealing with those bandits? She shook her head. We are successful because of you. A guest who does not help out is not worthy of staying with one such as you. Not after so long. And is that all you are? Something flashed across her face as she asked softly. Of course. Of course. You should eat your dinner first, then go back to working, if that's what you wish. Turning on her feet, she stalked off before 𝗍𝗹 could speak further. He knew what he had said was wrong, but was unable to let go of his attachments to before, to what he had been. Yet, as he looked down at the brush he held, the clipboard and worn hands, he wondered if the 𝗍𝗹, core cultivator and prodigy of the sect, nobleman's son, would even know him now. And if he met his old self, would he care to know him? We cannot offer you much. When my eldest son comes back from the war, the old man, 𝗍𝗵𝗂𝘁𝗪, said. His hands trembled a little, liver spots covering them as he stared up at the ex-cultivator. He had never gotten over his initial fear, his concerns about 𝗍𝗹's background. He could understand it, but if any of his old enemies knew he was alive. But it was 7 years since his clifftop fall, and none had found him. None were even looking. 𝗨 core cultivator, was dead as far as the jianghu was concerned. I know. I have saved a little, and if you will allow me, I will continue working here. She is a widow, with another man's child. That I see as my own. 𝗍𝗹's voice grew firm. And if they do not accept her or her son, I will. He can carry my name. That is very generous. 𝗳𝗵's eyes tracked down, focusing on his dantian for a second. The dantian that had been damaged but still contained the shards of his core. Shards that had been patched together, if only rudimentarily. In 7 years, 𝗳𝗵 had grown old and feeble as time caught up to him, but 𝗍𝗹 looked no different. Cultivator's body and soul. One day you will. Not so long as your daughter lives, and I will care for my son until he forms his own family, like he should, 𝗍𝗹 said firmly. There are some things more important than cultivation. And if he had a little moment of enlightenment, days ago one evening, when he had released himself from the memories of what he had been and his climb to immortality, that was no one's business but his own. Then, I will accept your cup of tea, 𝗳𝗵 said, relief in his voice. Relief that his daughter, whose husband had died and his family had disowned her, sending her back, would have a protector. More, someone who loved her. Thank you, Father. A cloud of shattered brick and compressed earth dust rose, the sprawled bodies of the quartet of gang members lying in the gaps between. 𝗍𝗹 stood before them, one hand idly holding the doll he had taken away from the lead bandit, the other lowering from having slapped the man away. He tossed the weapon, barely cared for, onto the ground and turned away from the beaten attackers to meet the gaze of his wife. She was old now. Nearly 3 decades had passed since they had first met. She was still spry, but lines along the eyes that had been hinted at now crossed her face and deepened under her eyes. Her forehead was no longer smooth like a jade piece, her hair no longer the lustrous black of youth, shot through with the occasional streak of white now. But her eyes sparkled, with outrage and concern, with intelligence and understanding. She was still as beautiful, if not more, than when he had first seen her. Though the flicker of betrayal, as she stared at him and the sword and then the bandits lying on the ground, made him flinch internally. For 𝗍𝗹 knew that what she had known, deep within, could no longer be avoided. A conversation that they had snuck around, to be finished later that day. Then, shouts from outside their gates. The city guards finally arrived, rounding up those gang members on the ground, pulling them up and tying their hands. There was a flurry of activity to be taken care of, statements to be given, bribes to be administered, repairs to be made. It was later that evening, much later, when both concerned elder brother and adopted son had been sent away, that she caught him contemplating the sliver of moon that poked its head out of the curtain of clouds, as if too shy to be seen this evening, or hiding from the wrath of the one that came. "You're healed," 𝗂𝗁 accused. "Yes," he acknowledged. "How long?" A moment's hesitation. 2 decades or so, now. "And?" She pounced, reading more than he had said, the way a true companion could. "I've grown, improved. Not to the nascent soul stage, but he was at peak core cultivation now, his core having filled itself. His cultivation progressing with the barest effort when, for days, years, he had struggled to make it move a little. He had found a 𝗍, even if he did not understand it himself. Perhaps existence was not meant to be understood so much as lived. "Then why are you still here?" 𝗂𝗁 said, glaring back at her husband, her partner. "Do you have to ask, after so many years? But you're an immortal, and I'm—" She did not need to say it. He had tried, they had tried again and again to clear her meridians. Even with his greater knowledge, his experience, and the pills they acquired, they had failed. Perhaps if he had met her a decade ago, while she was a teenager herself and before her meridians had clogged up further, it would have been possible. But now, she was stuck as a body cleanser, not much better than a mere mortal. "My wife," 𝗍𝗁 said, stepping forward and wrapping his arms around her. "And all that I need." She shook her head, protesting, but he silenced her with his lips. For a time, there was muffled silence in the courtyard, with only a silent moon to speak of what transpired below it. As always, the moon kept its secrets, imparting no knowledge or wisdom. "When I die?" She pushed away from his fingers that tried to shush her, playfully biting them until he pulled away. "When I die, you will return to your sect." "And confront my brother?" His ex-brother in arms, his most hated enemy from before, whom he had not thought of in decades. "And take your rightful place in the heavens." She hugged him again, harder when he tried to protest. "Promise me." "Our son has his own family and has chosen to live a mortal life. You know that," she growled. "He needs you not, and you have a fate much greater than ours." He shook his head. "Promise me." And because he could never gainsay her, he did. The mountain peak was as unchanged and beautiful as it always had been. Even over 6 decades on, it was little changed. Wisps of clouds ran along the towering granite mountain, its cliffs sheer and the only pathway so narrow even goats feared to thread the way up. Only the occasional stubborn greenery clung to cracks along its cliff walls, growing forth. 𝗍𝗁 stared up, and then chose to ignore the path. He flew up, effortlessly controlling his chi to rise through the air, riding the sword he borrowed for this very purpose. So many decades ago, taken from the gang leader that had dared to disturb their house. The magistrate had been very grateful for his help and allowed him to keep the sword. A pinnacle mortal 𝗀, and his involvement quiet. Now, he used it to fly upwards to see his second home, the one he had made after he had left his first home as a noble. the place where he grew to become a cultivator, a prodigy hailed by all. And he found that he could no more recognize it than the home of his father, now occupied by a branch family that had become main family. They had wanted to fade him, but they were not his family. His family he had left behind, buried, along with his heart, it seemed sometimes. He breached another cloud and a formation barrier with ease. His sect token, the one he had kept hidden for so long, flashed. The barrier recognized him, but also didn't. As he rose, within moments, guardians appeared at the edges of the cliff top, weapons drawn, ready to defend and attack. 𝗀𝗧 landed with a tap of his feet, catching the sword and sheathing it with nary a flourish. As an elder rushed over, he bowed to the group and made introductions. It was never easy returning home. Introductions and questions, interrogations, and even more investigations. Into his past, into his identity, into his cultivation level. Bureaucracy, as the sect scrambled to ascertain his identity, and then to find him a place to stay. For no senior elder of the sect could be put up in a guest house, and so, trouble. Then came the feast, the welcome dinner, more introductions, more questions. 𝗀𝗧 deflected as best as he could, until he found himself alone once more later that night. In the back gardens of his expansive home, overlooking the cliff and the clear night air as a full moon beamed down upon him. As a cold wind blew across the cliffs, stealing warmth and bringing the hints of colder nights from the north. He stood, staring outwards until he came. 𝗵𝗂𝘁 arrived, limping. He carried no weapon, though it mattered little with spirit rings. But as 𝗀𝗧 turned to look at his sectmate, his brother, he saw the wear of ages on him, injuries taken as he climbed the ladder of immortality, as he fought the sect's enemies and defended their brothers, a knee that no longer worked, a tremble in the left hand from poison snuck onto him, a shock of white hair from a cultivation session gone wrong. "You finally returned," 𝗵𝗂𝘁 said, his voice still filled with vigor. He tilted his chin up, and his chest jutted out as he spoke. "I have." "You did not tell the patriarch what I did." "I did not." "What do you want? Cultivation resources? Pills? Manuals?" 𝗵𝗂𝘁 said, his eyes narrowed. "To thank you." "I will not." "What?" 𝗵𝗂𝘁 shouted the last word. The cultivator was thrown off his script and the belief of how he thought this would go down. "To thank you for what you did on that cliff top." 𝗀𝗧's eyes crinkled in humor, knowing what he was doing. But still, he was sincere in his words and feelings. "I tried to kill you," 𝗵𝗂𝘁 said. "You should be raging, trying to kill me." 𝗀𝗧 shook his head. "That is a young person's answer. We are not young anymore. Neither of us." "That's true enough." 𝗵𝗂𝘁's chin came down, his posture relaxing a little. "But to thank me?" "You were right in some ways. I was arrogant. I did look down on you a little," 𝗀𝗧 said, speaking slowly, as if recalling things from a long-forgotten past. "But more, your actions put me on a different path. You allowed me to see a world, live a life that I would never have chosen before." He trailed off, shaking his head as he turned back to looking over the cliff. "So, thank you." 𝗵𝗂𝘁 deflated then. He walked up to his friend, standing beside him as he stared out over the mountain range and the open air. He drew a deep breath and found his back straightening a little as a burden long carried fled. "You've changed," 𝗵𝗂𝘁 said, side-eyeing his friend. "As have you," 𝗀𝗧 said. unable to see the angry, bitter young man who had attacked him anymore. But perhaps, if he squinted, he might see someone else, a younger friend. After that day, after that fight, a lot changed. 𝗵𝗂𝗁 ran a hand through his hair, looking tired for a moment. More than I could ever have imagined. 𝗬𝗁 looked at his friend, his brother, his enemy, and said, "Then tell me, brother, and I'll tell you of my own mortal life." "He could have ascended," the old man said, his left hand trembling, the streak of white hair now encompassing his entire head. Deep wrinkles crisscrossed his face, and splotches of bad blood from a failing liver could be seen on wrinkled arms and fingers. Before him sat a group of students, youngsters, all of them. Barely in their mid-teens, all of them enterprising body-cleansing cultivators, taking their first real step towards immortality. 𝗵𝗂𝗁 stared at their faces, and he could barely remember his time seated cross-legged like them, seated with his friend, his brother, 𝗬𝗁. He could have ascended, but chose not to. He stayed in the sect for another 50 years, defending it, teaching, but he never progressed his cultivation another step. 𝗵𝗂𝗁 shook his head. He could have. He should have, but when we asked him, begged him to do so, he always refused.
He gave up?
A child, an impetuous child, spoke up, her cute button nose turning up in disdain. No, 𝗵𝗂𝗁 said heatedly. My brother did not give up. He just saw a better way. He would not ascend, not this life, for he would not leave her behind.
His mortal wife?
Incredulity among so many of the other cultivators. Yes, 𝗵𝗂𝗁 leaned forward. When they both return, in this cycle or next, he will ascend, with her, as he has vowed. Do not doubt that. There were scoffing noises, but none dared voice it aloud. Not and be punished. Already they were pushing the boundaries of custom and decorum. But 𝗵𝗂𝗁 cared not. He understood this story, their story, was not a conventional one. The ending was uncertain and unconventional. He watched as they streamed away after dismissal, stared at their fading backs, and considered his own cultivation, his own journey. So much had changed since that clifftop. His own cultivation path had diverged, and then diverged again when his brother returned. On that clifftop, more than one life had changed. And now, here, at the end of his life, he could not tell who had changed more from that one moment of anger and jealousy. He hoped, perhaps, when his brother and his wife reincarnated, when he did, they might meet again and share a cup of tea on a clifftop. The end. You have been listening to Clifftop Crisis and Transformation, written by 𝗬𝗏, narrated by Eric Yang. Production copyright 2021 by 𝗬𝗏, Starlit Publishing.